And welcome back to 35,000 Watts, the podcast. My name is Michael Millard. I'm here with Scott Mobley and Keith Porterfield. We are three ex-College Radio DJs and executive staffers, and today we are really delving into that even more than usual. We usually talk a lot more about music and college radio, college radio's influence on music and artists that got their start on college radio. This time we're actually going to talk more about our personal experiences with college radio. This is our final episode of season 2, and I'll just go ahead and call myself out. In classic college radio fashion, we actually recorded this episode about 6 months ago for the end of season 1, and as befitting an episode about college radio, I completely muffed the audio and ruined the entire interview and wasn't able to put the episode together. So flashing back to my years in college radio, trying to figure out the analog tape machine and learning how to edit on analog tape, it was something akin to that. So yeah, we're actually kind of redoing the episode, but we really loved how it came out. We enjoy talking about our personal experiences, so we're gonna do it again. This will be new for you guys out there, but a little bit of a redo for us. But I think we decided it was like 6 months ago that we recorded. We really don't remember exactly everything we said and all that, so it should be hopefully fun and fresh. And so 35,000 Watts, the story of college radio, is a documentary film that I made about, not necessarily about my experience with college radio, but it was certainly informed by my experience at KTXT at Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas, which is where all three of us worked and met at the radio station. And the film kind of delves into my personal story, so I'm going to be relatively brief with my experience. But I discovered KTXT when I was a junior in high school, and I literally tried to start my car one night and the battery had died, and when I got jump started, the radio reset to 88.1 because that's like the very first station on the digital dial, and I was listening to, and I will cop to the fact that in the film I kind of mentioned a Nirvana song as being kind of the entree into KTXT. It was really Nine Inch Nails' Sin was actually the first song that I ever heard on KTXT. A show called Shockwaves was on. It was a late night Friday night show that was like club music and dance music, and I was kind of getting into that a little bit already. I was getting into techno, and a friend had introduced me to like Nine Inch Nails actually relatively recently, and New Order was another band that I was just getting familiar with. So when I was hearing this music on the radio, I was digging it and I was really liking it. And it took me probably 10 or 15 minutes before I was like, this is not the top 40 station. Like, I could definitely tell that this was something new, and I realized what had happened, and that was it. Like, I was kind of hooked on listening to 88.1 a lot more. I will say I didn't just immediately, throw away all my albums and change my radio presets and give up on the music I was listening to. It was definitely a process, but that was when I understood what college radio was and figured out that Texas Tech had a college station, and I started listening to it more in high school. And then when I got to Texas Tech, I didn't immediately go to the station, but halfway through my freshman year, I was living in the dorms, and a friend of mine knew I was really into radio because I was definitely a radio geek and I talked about radio all the time. And he was like, I listen to KTXT, and I think they look for DJs and they need DJs, and you should go down there and see. And that isn't exactly how KTXT worked. Like, you actually kind of had to be there at the beginning of the semester and be part of the meeting to get on the air. But the semester had already started, and I actually worked up the courage to just walk into the station, and I introduced myself to the first person I saw, who happened to be Chad Kopek, who is the operations director at the station and is in the film and is a super nice guy. And I think he kind of took pity on me, and he could tell that I was like a fellow radio nerd, and let me sign up and put me on the sub list at the very bottom. And, that was kind of how you broke into KTXT, was being a substitute DJ, where they would call you at the worst possible time and the worst possible hour, and you'd have to go up and do a shift. And if you didn't screw it up and ingratiated yourself to the right people, you might be able to get more shifts and maybe even, eventually get a permanent shift. And I didn't get called initially, and I think it was probably about 6 weeks after that, the women's basketball team at Texas Tech won the national championship. And after they won the national championship, they had scheduled this really big rally at the football stadium. So, it was like 40 or 50,000 people were going to go and celebrate the women's national basketball championship. And of course, everybody wanted to be there and nobody wanted to DJ during that particular time. And so that was when I got my very first call to come in and substitute. I was more than happy to I would have missed almost anything that had been going on that day, so I could go and do a shift at KTXT. And so I got like the quick, here's how this all works. And I think I did a stop set, and they were like, okay, yeah, you got it. And they went off to go to the celebration. So I was DJing for maybe 3 people because everybody was, at this big women's national basketball championship thing. So I guess I probably had it easy in that I had an inkling that there weren't maybe that many people listening for my first shift, but man, I was hooked. I enjoyed every minute of it. It went by so fast. I couldn't believe that 3 hours went by. It felt like 10 minutes. And yeah, I still remember some of the music I played that day. I absolutely remember like the smell of the station and being nervous and my fingers shaking when I was trying to put the needle on the record for the first time. And just, doing the film helped me kind of go back and remember that. And hopefully you guys had like a similar experience with watching the film, and then maybe now that we're doing the podcast, kind of like going back. It's about roughly 30 years or so for all of us, to look back on those times. And I mean, I think we'll talk about this, and I'll let you guys talk about this more. But for me, once I got over the initial excitement of just being on the air and playing music for people and being a DJ, the thing that I got out of KTXT was meeting the people. And like, here was like a station full of people. There were probably 30-ish like permanent DJs, like 10 executive staffers, and then maybe 20 or 30 substitutes. So there was, let's say 50 people or so that were orbiting around this station, who were all, for the most part, to a person, men and women, like super into the music, super into radio, who were kind of serious about doing radio and wanted it to be good and wanted it to not suck and wanted people to listen to the station. So it wasn't just that they loved music and that we had that shared experience, but also that we actually tried really hard, I think, for the most part, all of us, to not suck, to be good, to be on the air and sound good and not make mistakes. And I think that made it more exciting for me than if it had just been like a half-assed, like, I just go up there and do whatever. And, nobody's listening, because that wasn't the case. People were listening, and KTXT was an influence in Lubbock because we predated alternative music really, leaking over to like the classic rock station. And we never really had a commercial alternative station in Lubbock. So we were the source for a lot of music that was coming out. And we were there at a time when it was becoming so big that of course we had a lot of listeners. And so I really appreciated the fact that not only was I getting to hang out with people that had the same interest as in me, and not only was I able to do this thing that I had wanted to do for years and years and years, it was really cool that people wanted it to be a successful station and a station that people wanted to listen to, and that people took it serious, because that just made it kind of more fun for me. But yeah, that's kind of a quick overview of my story. I think I want to give you guys time to go into more depth, because again, I talk a lot about my experience in the film. So I know that I met both of you there. I think I met Scott. I met you first because I think you were doing a power lunch, and I think I came in after you. You had been there for a year or two maybe already. But I remember you had won an award already for being like one of the best announcer at KTXT, and I was really watching you really closely. I would come in a little early and like be in the booth, and so that was how we met. And yeah, I'm kind of curious like what your story was before that, like before I met you, kind of how you got into the station and how you felt about it.
So I started there in the summer of '92. I remember sort of being peripherally aware of KTXT, but I didn't know much about it. What happened to me was, this was, between my third and fourth year at Texas Tech. I went there for 5.5 years, so I don't think the story gets shorter, but this was summer '92. Between my third and fourth year there, I had just taken my first class in radio with Dr. Kinghorn, who was the faculty advisor for KTXT. And he told me, we have a radio station here on campus. You should go put your name in the hat and see if you can get on there. It's a lot of fun, blah, blah, blah. He kind of sent me that way. And he told me, you should go in the summer. He goes, if you're going to be in here in the summer, go in the summer, because there's less people vying for spots. And later on down the road, and I'll get to this, but the other one down the road, I was the guy who did that hiring. I was the operations manager for, I think, only half a year, but I was the guy that made those decisions. Who goes on the sub list, who gets what shift, whatever. And what people maybe don't realize about that is that once you got in at KTXT, you really weren't getting out unless you just did something egregious. There was no, well, this guy's not that great, so we're going to boot him out and bring this new guy in. Basically, once you got a spot, you had a spot,
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about getting on there, like you said, I think there were probably roughly 40 to 50 spots, maybe, on the air. 40 is probably a good number. And 35 of those were already taken by people who were there the semester before. So getting in the door was nothing more than a brush of luck. It's really all it is. I would love to think that somebody said something to somebody and somebody said I should be on there and somebody said, I don't think any of that happened. I think they reached into a hat and pulled out a name and it happened to be mine. And I think about how much of my life was affected by the moment someone pulled that name out of that hat. I made a career out of this for a long time and loved it. And I really found my place there. So I go in the summer of 92. I get the call that I've been given a shift. My shift was, I want to say 6 to 9 a.m. on Saturday mornings. It was, if it wasn't that, it was 7 to 10. It was early in the morning on Saturday. And so I go for my first shift. James Faust, who's in your film, meets me there. He gives me kind of a run around. The first hour, we just play music. No talking, no messing with the microphone. We just play music. And then we get to the end of the hour and we had a little dead spot. And he said, okay, when this happens, you get to pick a song. This may or may not be true, but in my head, I've always thought it was some kind of test. What song is he going to pick? And I picked the song Ripple by Jane's Addiction, which is a cover of a Grateful Dead tune. And kind of nodded his head. He said, okay, that's a good one. We played. He says, when that song's over, do your top of the hour, do your announcement, whatever. I turn on the mic. I do that. I turn off the mic. And James says, all right, I'm out. And he left. And I had 2 more hours to do with just the knowledge that I had at that point. It was nerve-wracking. It was terrifying. And I still left that day going, I want to do this. Whatever this is, I want to do it. I had a blast. And so that was my start at KTXT. Now, in the short 2 years I was there, moved up the ladder pretty quickly. I never really pursued like being the station manager or anything else because I really wasn't my interest. I never really had an interest in the management part of radio. I was more interested in talking into a microphone and being on the air, and that's what I was doing. But after I had been there, I think when the fall started, so that summer I did that shift. And then when the fall started, I was given a power lunch, like you said, which was this daily request show we had around lunchtime. And then after that, I was offered a show called The Weekend Assault, where the station manager and operations manager at that time would go out to a bar or restaurant or something and hang out and do kind of a remote thing. And I was the guy in the studio that was playing music and, doing their phone-ins and all that kind of stuff. That was a fun show. I don't think it ever got as popular as maybe we wanted it to get, but it was fun to do. It was fun to execute. And every once in a while, they let me out of the cage and let me go out and be the guy in the bar. That was fun. So, like you said, at the end of that year, I won the award for most promising broadcaster. And then the next year, because of some shifts in the management, some people came and went and whatever, and there was a little controversy and stuff there. But I was asked to be the operations manager for the spring that year. That's where I get this thing about pulling names out of a hat, because that's what I did. We got 60 applications. We had 10 spots, and I randomly picked the people to get them. I did not know who they were. I did not know anything about them. They weren't auditioned. I just put them on the air, and I was the guy that trained them and all that stuff. And so that was fun. I did air checks with people and things like that. I enjoyed that part of the job. The next big thing that happened to me there was Coca-Cola was hiring college radio DJs to go down to South Padre Island and DJ on the beach for this volleyball tournament and basketball tournament they were having. This was offered to the station manager and operations manager at the time. And I cannot tell you why. I don't even want to know why, I think, but they didn't want to go. And so they offered it to me, this guy who had been there for maybe 8 months at the time and, whatever. But they said, you can do this if you want to. So I flew down to South Padre Island. I DJ'd on the beach every day for 4 hours during spring break. They gave me an envelope full of cash and a 2-bedroom suite at the Radisson there on South Padre, and let 20-year-old me go nuts. And it was a good time. So the end of that year, I won the Outstanding Broadcaster Award. And so, 2 years at that station, I, kind of rocketed to success. I really enjoyed what I did there. And in that short time, the impact made on me by working at that station is undeniable and a huge part of who I am and what I became afterwards and all that stuff. And it all came down to somebody reaching into the hat and pulling my name out. And so I am thankful to the universe for that, whoever guided their hand to my name. And, that is a part of my life that I cherish above almost any other. And it really is a big part of who I am. So I have KTXT to thank for that. And kind of the point of all these stories being that I really kind of fell backwards into all of it. I got hired on a stroke of luck. I moved up the ladder on a stroke of luck. I went to South Padre Island on a stroke of luck. It was all just kind of falling into place for me in a way that it probably didn't for anybody else. I was very, very, very lucky and was happy to be there. But that's my story of KTXT, one of the biggest chapters of my life.
Yeah, when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do, when I knew I wanted to make a documentary film, and I had this vision of like a door. Everybody at some point in their life walks through a door, like a literal physical door. And once you walk through that door, your life is never the same after that moment. And for me, that door was the door to the journalism building at KTXT. That I walked through that door, I met Chad Kopek, and every single thing that happened in my life after that, the friends I hung out with, the jobs that I had, what I wanted to do with my life, like literally, a life-changing thing. It seems that that's a pretty common thing. Like so many people's lives, it wasn't just like, oh yeah, I did this thing in college and that was all. Like, no, they have 100 stories. They talk about all the ways that made their life, the friends they still have, their job, their career. Even if they didn't go into broadcasting, it still maybe made an impact on what they ended up doing in their life. So I found that pretty fascinating while we were interviewing people for the film, just how big of an impact that it had on me, on other people, and it seems like almost everybody who did it. And so for me, I don't know if it was someone pulling a name out of a hat so much as me just pestering the hell out of everybody all the time to get on there. Like I just lived at the station constantly once I got my foot in the door. So for me, it may have been a little bit of luck and a little bit of just being annoying to the point where they're like, all right, we got to give this guy a shift.
I think that was my next move. If I hadn't gotten on there, I was just going to go hang out. And, and if I had made the sub list, I was going to go hang out and tell people, hey, if you need a sub, I'm your guy. I was going to sell that. I just ended up not having to do it. I just got lucky, and I'm totally fine admitting it was luck, because it was. But I think once I got in that door, I certainly put in the work and time to prove to them that I deserved to be there and wanted to be there and could excel at it. And that's probably responsible for most of those other moves I mentioned. But it still was a matter of, this guy quit, or this guy had to leave, or this guy didn't want to go to South Padre Island and get handed $500 a day. Don't ask me why. And I kind of got to do all those things because of that, and I do consider it a little bit of a stroke of luck. But yeah, I definitely, had I not gotten in on that first try, I would have been living at that station until somebody let me talk into a microphone. And I just didn't have to do that. And you're right. I really think, I mentioned this in another episode, that there was a moment there, a couple of moments actually, where I finally, after being at Tech for 3 years, and I had friends and I had a job, I had lots of going on. That was the moment where I found my gang. That was the moment where I found the group of people that were interested in the same things I was and going down the same path I was and been pursuing the same things that I was. I hadn't met them before I got to KTXT. And once I did, I embraced it with both arms and enjoyed the ride.
So I annoyed myself right into an executive staff position, which eventually became a station manager position. And one of the first things you have to do as a station manager is choose your executive staff. And I had started putting names together, and I had someone in mind for music director, and it was kind of almost a done deal, but I wanted to go through the interview process. But you, Scott, actually were like, hey, I have a friend who I think really could do this job. And you introduced me to someone who was on this very podcast by the name of Keith Porterfield.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the different ways you got there. Scott, you kind of lucked into it. Michael, you said you kind of pestered your way into it. I was kind of a hybrid of that, because when I got involved with the radio station, Scott and I were already friends. And so you were already there. You had already been doing shifts. I don't know that you were the exec staff yet. I'm not sure about the timing of that. But so, not that I necessarily had an in, but I did know somebody there already. And so for me, it all started in the fall of '93. I went to the meeting at the beginning of the semester, ended up getting on the sub list. I didn't get a shift right off the bat. And I went through most of that semester without ever receiving a call. It was late in the semester before I finally got a call. At that point, I'd gone to the meeting and I had signed up. I had never set foot in the studio at that point. So I showed up on the day, someone finally called me for a shift. It was the shift after a power lunch. So I think it was like 3 to 6 in the afternoon. And I showed up just sight unseen. I had never even stepped foot in the booth at that point. I'm here. Let's do this thing. The guy that was on the shift before me, was able to show me a couple of things, but he had to get out of there. I guess he had class or something, who knows. And so I'm just kind of sitting there like, I'm supposedly about to be on the radio and I don't don't know thing one about what's going on here. Luckily, there were some of the exec staff there at the time, James Faust being one of them, who's also in the film and who Scott also mentioned. He came in and helped train me a little bit. And so I got through that first afternoon shift, that one sub shift. I don't remember a lot about it. You guys talk about specific memories about your first time there. To me, everything was happening so fast that, by the time it was done, I was like, okay, we got through that. What did I just do? I didn't remember pretty much anything about it, But a couple of weeks after that anyway, I got a call and a full-time shift had come open. It was a 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift on Saturday morning. But it was open and they wanted someone to do it and they were asking me. And so I said, yes, of course, I'm going to do that. And that was late in the semester because I didn't have to do that shift very often. I probably only did it 5 or 6 times, dragging myself up there at 3 o'clock in the morning and going until 6 o'clock. And I do have one funny story about that. I found out later that at one point, my mom had tuned in, the town I grew up in was about an hour's drive out of Lubbock. And she knew I was going to be on that morning. So she got up early and tuned in. And I played a song by The and announced it as being by The. And she didn't know that was the name of a band. And so she thought that I was so tired that I was stuttering. She thought, oh, poor Keith, he's been up there all night. And he's tired and he's stuttering. And he's not getting it done, not getting it right. All that. No, Mom, yeah, that's the name of the band. It's The. So, but yeah, so I finished out that fall semester doing that overnight shift. The spring semester rolls around. I got a power lunch shift, which may have had something to do with Scott as well. That's entirely possible. But those were pretty sought after shifts. That was the lunchtime request show. So we were on 12 to 3. We took requests for the first couple of hours. Really enjoyed that. And that was when it was that spring semester that I started hanging around the station a lot while I was doing the power lunch. And sure enough, when the end of the semester is rolling around, we're getting ready for, to get the exec staff set up for the next semester for the summer session. And Michael, you got the job as the station manager. I did put in an application for music director at the time. And this was, it's funny, you mentioned you had somebody in mind. I've got to tell this story. I'm in the booth one day and it's right toward the end of the semester. You had already gotten the job as station manager, but had not hired the rest of the exec staff yet. And I'm sitting there, I'm doing my thing, and you and someone else, may have been Faust or Kopek or one of those guys, came into the booth and we're kind of talking about some stuff you were going to do once you took over and all that. And I'm sitting there doing my thing and I'm listening to what's going on, but I'm trying not to, to act like I'm listening. And you said something to the effect of, and then when Jason moves into the music director's office and you pause for a second, you're like, or whoever the new music director is. And you kind of whatever it was you were saying. And I was just like, all right, well, okay. All I can do is make my pitch, go into my interview and make my pitch. And that's exactly what I did. We had our interview and I did have a pitch. I had an idea, when we went in, or when I went in there, my thought was, the kind of music we play at this radio station right now is having its moment. This was in the, spring of 94. And so, the grunge movement is in full swing and, you've got 120 Minutes and Alternative Nation on MTV. And so alternative music, as it was called at the time, was having its moment. And that's when I went in there, that's what I said. This is the time for this kind of music. We can capture a big audience. I don't want us to be a niche thing in this market anymore. I want to trade punches with the big boys. I want to go against the rock station. I want to go against the top 40 station. And I think we can streamline our sound and do that. And I think we can kind of ride this wave into bigger portion of the Lubbock radio market. And I guess it was on the strength of that interview because we hadn't really met aside from a meeting in passing before that. And sure enough, once the exec positions got posted, I went and checked it out, and there was my name. I was the next music director. I couldn't believe it. I don't know what the word I want to use. A special moment for me because I did not expect it. Like I really thought this other guy was going to get it. I was just going to go through the process and then hopefully get back on the air and keep doing my thing. And to find out that I'd gotten that position was really great for me. So yeah, I spent the year as a music director. It was a lot of fun, and we did go in and kind of radically rework the sound of the station. I'm sure you remember this, Michael, but we did a pretty serious overhaul on the way the music system picked songs, the rotation system. We went in at the time that I started there. You were just as likely to get a random album track from some band that had only put out one album as you were to get whatever the huge song off the most recent Smashing Pumpkins album was. Like those, once they were through with their main run through the top 35, those songs were like, equivalent in the rotation system. And so we set up some tiers where you were going to more likely to get the stuff you had heard before from bigger bands and all that, so that you didn't have long, runs through the program where you weren't hearing anybody you'd ever heard before or never heard before, that kind of thing. And so, and we did well. We got added to the core 50 CMJ reporter list during my time as music director there. That was one of my favorite, or the things I'm most proud of about that time. We never really were able to get the full validation to find out what our ratings looked like, but I know that we were able to look and see that there was in the book, there was a category for, non-commercial radio. And we were able to see that our listenership kept rising. I mean, it was only us and the classical station. So maybe it was the case that the classical station was suddenly pulling in a lot more listeners than they had ever pulled in before. But I'd like to think that probably wasn't the case, that it actually was what we were doing there. So yeah, that was my favorite thing about my entire time at KTXT, was being the music director and being able the guy that was picking the music that went on the air and driving around town and hearing my songs, that I had chosen, playing on the radio in the same space with stuff that's playing on the big rock station and the same top 40 station. Yeah, it was awesome. During that time on the air, I took over for you, Michael, on a show called Retro Radio, which was our 80s new wave retro show. I started doing that, I think, in the fall of '94, if I remember right, and then stuck with that. That was my show for pretty much the rest of my time there. Doing the 80s retro show. Really enjoyed that too. It was mostly requests, so I got tons of calls. So yeah, it was a lot of fun to do that as well. After the year of music director, I never, when I went into KTXT, it never was a thing where I was thinking, one of these days I'm going to run this place. One of these days I'm going to be the manager. But after that year, I felt like I needed to step forward. I probably should have gone for another year of music director. I think that's what I was best at, what I was really good at the station. But to me, that was kind of a lateral move, and I felt like I needed to progress. I needed to move forward. So I ended up throwing my hat in the ring to be the next station manager, which I got, and became the manager for the 95, 96 school year. And I had a lot of fun as the station manager. I really did. Like I said, in retrospect, I probably should have just gone for another year of music director. I'm not going to sit here and claim I was the best station manager that place ever had. To the extent that my time there was a success, it was largely a success due to my exec staff that I hired. I think the best thing I ever did was hiring those guys. So I do want to send a quick shout out to Diamond Rob, Sean, Stacy and Stacy, JP, Danielle, Zoltan, Dina, Erica, and Lisa. All of you guys. If it hadn't been for you guys, I had my time there as the station manager would not have been anywhere near as successful as it was. So I owe a lot to them. They were the ones that really did the heavy lifting while I was the station manager. But we did some fun stuff too while I was there station manager. We did the 88-hour marathon where Rob, Sean, and I, one of the three of us was on the booth for 88 straight hours, and the other two were either out doing remote broadcasts or in the studio as well. Our rule at the time was that you could go home to take a shower, but otherwise you had to be at the station the entire time. So we slept up there, we ate our meals up there for 88 straight hours. It was just the three of us on the air. So that was probably the most fun thing we did during my time as the station manager. But yeah, the whole thing was great. After my year of station manager, I kind of backed away from the station, where old station managers were kind of encouraged not to be around, to let the new staff kind of do their thing. And so I did that. About a year later, I was taking a summer class, and I went back to the radio station and did one summer session, did a power lunch again. Came back in and did that last little time there. And that was awesome too, just because, at that point I was not in charge. I was not programming the station, not doing anything. It was a chance just to go back and just play some music. And so that was cool. Really enjoyed that little kind of coda to my time at KTXT. But yeah, that's in a nutshell my story there. And very much feel the same way as you guys both have expressed, that, the friendships I made there and the people I met there have lasted me for a lot of years, and really it was a life-changing thing. It was, both for what I would do afterwards. I wasn't in the radio world too much longer after that, but also it really just helped me as a person, I think, to gain some confidence and to be, better able to express myself and in situations where I was working with other people and all of us working toward a similar goal and that kind of thing. And just like I said, the friendships I gained there are something I'll always treasure and remember to this day. So yeah, one of the best experiences of my life. I think you guys both said the same thing. But yeah, so much fun. And look, here we are today, 30 years later, we're talking about it, still here, even to this day. It still, weighs heavily on my life even now. So yeah, it was great. It was one of the highlights of my life for sure.
That's one of the incredible things about it, is like people just like it stays with you for your entire life.
I wanted to say a little something about the music directorship that you had, because it, and I'll not mention names and walk lightly here, but when I first started at the station, we had a music director whose basic MO was, if any other radio station besides this one plays it, then we're no longer going to play it. And I think that also held true of MTV. So our music at that time was very eclectic, very underground, very weird. And then the music director after that person was kind of the exact opposite, where we were trying to play everything. Like, an album would come out and we'd add 10 songs off of it or whatever, So when you became the music director, and I was gone at this point, but I remember listening to the station, you did something in that streamlining of it where, you kind of made it sound more like a commercial radio station, and that, these are the songs you're going to hear a lot. These are the songs you're going to hear every once in a while. These are going to pop up every so often. When I first started there, you could play a 3-hour shift and not play one song you'd ever heard before. It happened all the time. And, as I moved through there, I had enough juice to where nobody was watching my music logs. I played what I wanted for the most part, or I was on a request show, or I was, like Weekend Assault. We didn't have a format. Right after I left college and KTXT, I went to work for the Top 40 station there in Lubbock, and I was trying to think of a song that we played nonstop, like that. This was the Alanis Morissette, Hootie and the Blowfish era. So let's say "Ironic" by Alanis Morissette. If I did 4 hours on the air at that station, I would play that song 5 times. I'm not making that up. It was every 40 minutes they were in rotation, and then the other songs would pop up once in a while. You guys kind of brought that in at KTXT and made and streamlined that to where it sounded more like a commercial radio station. And if I turned on KTXT for an hour, I was guaranteed to hear one red hot popular song, whatever it was at the time, and before you guys did that, it really wasn't the case. You could listen for 3 hours and not hear a Nirvana song, not hear a Pearl Jam song, it just didn't happen. You were playing all this obscure music. So it really was a nice shift in the music aspect of the station. It became it sounded much more like a commercial radio station than it probably had any right to be, honestly, but it was a great training ground for us, because I talked to a lot of people that worked in college radio at other places. They did not get that experience. They could not walk out of there and walk into a commercial radio station and be on the air, and we could. In fact, we all did, I think. But if you worked at KTXT for a year and you believed in it and you practiced it and you worked at it and you got good at it, you could walk out the doors of KTXT and walk over to Z102 and get right on the air. And that's what happened to me, and that's what happened to a lot of people there. And so it really was a great learning experience, and the fact that it operated like a real radio station was a definite plus.
Yeah, well, that was the idea, is we were going to make it sound more like a commercial radio station. That was part of what I wanted to do. Is in competing with the other stations, I knew that we had to tighten that up, that people had to be able to be guaranteed that they were going to hear something that they knew and liked when they turned us on. And then once we got them in the door with that, we could hit them with the weird eclectic stuff, and that stuff I felt was good enough that we could keep them there. But for me, when a song got played on another radio station or on MTV or something like that, it was not time to kick it out of rotation. That meant that, one of ours made good. We need to push that. We need to get on that and make sure that we're playing it and people, relate it with us. That was not the time to get rid of it. That was the time to celebrate it, and I think that had a lot to do with kind of the change in music direction that you were talking about.
Well, I think the interesting thing about that is, during my time there, which was pre this, before it got a little more streamlined, the most popular things on that station were the request shows, retro radio, Power Lunch, Weekend Assault. That's when the phone was ringing off the hook. And that's when people were listening because they knew that they were going to hear those more popular songs. They were going to hear what they were hearing on MTV. The regular format was not as popular. It wasn't as listened to because you never knew what you were going to get. And once it got streamlined a little bit, I think that's when things really started to take off. I would run into people all the time that would say, oh, I listen to KTXT all the time. People that weren't in there, and it was a popular radio station at that time in Lubbock. And like you said, Michael, earlier, we didn't have an Edge station or, any of that. We were it. We were the alternative radio station.
That's the key. And that's what I think. So now at the time, like I was at KTXT in Lubbock, I had never talked to anyone who worked at any other college radio station. I didn't really, we knew from CMJ what other stations did to some degree, but what I've learned is that, so there's different schools of thought with college radio, right? First of all, you have like the freeform college radio stations. And I think KUT in Austin is a good example of that, where it's, every DJ plays whatever they want. And quite honestly, it can be unlistenable at times. It's not something that you can just tune into and know for sure this is what I'm going to get. And I'm speaking retrospectively, but I think some of this still applies to some stations today. But looking back at like the time we were there, I remember going to Austin and being excited, like, oh, they have a college radio station, and then being like, ugh, I don't know, I'm not digging
strange.
this, but
still
it was really weird. Because that's fine. But then you have stations like KTXT who are programming the way a radio station would normally program. We were a training station. Our mission was to train people for broadcasting, and that's what we did, and that's why we did it that way. But inside of that, then you still have, well, what music is in rotation? How is it rotated? How does the rotation software work? Do you understand that? And what do you do with that? And you have people with different mindsets about that. The person you mentioned who was there, before I got there and right before you got there was very, very much felt like college radio needed to be incredibly eclectic and we needed to, shun the mainstream or whatever. My feeling was, and the reason I hired Keith, because I felt like his feeling was, we're in Lubbock. There is no outlet. If you're in LA or you're in New York or Chicago or even Dallas, because they had the Edge, as a college radio station, you can afford to be a little more eclectic because people can go and find a station that'll play Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Smashing Pumpkins and Red Hot Chili Peppers and these bands that were huge, and listen to them in a radio format, and sure, there was MTV, but when you drop below that tier of bands and still talk about, like, say, Matthew Sweet, for example, is someone that I think some college radio music directors would say, well, he's too big and, he already has an audience and he maybe got on 120 minutes one time, so we don't need to be playing him. Whereas I would, obviously argue Matthew Sweet is like a classic person that should be on college radio. Like that's a perfect college radio artist especially for a station like KTXT, because if you lived in Lubbock in, say, 1993, unless you were waiting for that one time that maybe MTV might play a Matthew Sweet song, you're not going to hear Matthew Sweet. You're not going to hear anybody at that tier and anybody below that tier in terms of popularity, because there's only so many slots available, right? You can play maybe 12 to 14 songs an hour usually on a radio station, less than that on a format like MTV where you've got these long commercial breaks. So I mean, I don't think we were starving anybody of all this like super eclectic music that very few people honestly really wanted to listen to, in favor of things that were theoretically too mainstream or whatever. I just never felt that way. I felt like we were providing to Lubbock and the surrounding communities even more so an outlet that they could hear this thing that was happening everywhere, this thing that was blowing up, all these bands that were getting popular, and they were some of them getting mainstream notice, and some of them were getting just a little tiny bit of fame on a show like 120 Minutes or Alternative Nation, but never even broke into like the regular MTV rotation, and certainly weren't going to get played on Z102, which was the top 40 station, or FMX, which was the classic rock station. So I never felt bad about that. Like I do think that the people have mentioned sometimes some of the bands we talked about in the film, or, talked about their experience of like, oh no, we were freeform and you could go and play whatever you wanted and do whatever you wanted and say whatever you wanted. And there's a place for that. And I'm not saying that a college radio station, especially in a bigger city, shouldn't be that way. But we chose a different path for a couple of reasons. Again, one, we were a training station. We were very much focused on training people to go into radio and be able to be successful right off the bat. But, Keith and I in particular had just a moment and some conversations about where we wanted to take the station in that direction in terms of the way the rotation worked, and the terms of the way the music that you listen to, or the way, like, if you listen to the station for an hour, what your experience was going to be like. And I still stand by that. I think that there were people that disagreed with that maybe. And I think that's fine, but that was our goal. And I think we did a pretty darn good job of it, if I'm any judge of that. And I think it worked really well to bring more people into our fold. And, it doesn't hurt a radio station to have listeners. Like, that's what keeps them alive. Like, no, we're not selling advertising, and no, we weren't funded strictly through underwriting or whatever. But if you are running a radio station that no one listens to, eventually the administration is going to have plenty of reasons to just cut that funding off, and no one's going to raise a stink because no one listens to it. So I do think that there's something to be said for understanding the role that building your listenership has and playing music that people want to hear. I think that was important then, and I think it's still important now in a different way. The landscape has completely changed, but you can't just say, well, screw it, I'm just going to do what I want and say what I want and play what I want and not care about who's listening, because that's a really fantastic way to have the radio station taken away from you at some point. And we weren't really worried about that at the time. We just had a vision for what we wanted to do, and Keith's vision really matched my vision, and he like took it and ran with it and executed it perfectly. And yeah, I still kind of stand by that, but it's not for everybody, and it's not the decision everybody would have made in that position. But I felt good about it, and I liked the direction that the station went once we made those changes.
We also had the advantage of, at this time, this music started to get really popular, which I'm sure helped. Yeah. But what you guys did as far as streamlining that format a little bit is exactly what needed to happen to get people to turn over to the station. You could have, with a different music director or a different attitude about it, going, okay, well, yeah, Pearl Jam's super popular, but we're not playing that anymore. Here's another one by the Shags or one of those things. The decision to try to sort of embrace this type of music that was getting popular and make it sound like a more mainstream radio format was a stroke of genius, and it worked really well. People loved the station back then.
But that's also kind of the beauty of college radio, is that when we came in, Michael and I did have that vision and were able to execute and make it sound like that. But within a couple of years, you could have someone who come in with a completely different vision of it and completely turn it on its head, so that it was something else. That was kind of the beauty of college radio, is that, you could play with that format a little bit. Like I said, I wanted us to be trading punches with the big boys. I wanted us to be fighting FMX for listeners. But if that was not your goal, if your goal was, I want people who tune into the station to hear something they've never heard before, and, whether it's good or not, have them experience something that they're not going to experience everywhere else. Just as valid a way to run it, and something that you could do if you wanted to do it that way, is just kind of, we chose to take it another direction. But yeah, again, that's college radio. That's the beauty of it, is you can kind of take it in the direction you want to go, and subsequent, regimes can change things if they want to, and make it their own, as they choose to do.
And I'm a believer in what you said earlier about, you give them a Pearl Jam, you give them a Smashing Pumpkins, you give them a Nirvana, but then you can slide in something else. You give them the Spoonful of Sugar, and then you can go more eclectic. You can introduce them to music from bands they haven't heard of, and they will stay tuned because they know, man, maybe they don't like that song, but they know another good song is coming up in 5 minutes, so they're not going to tune away. And that is something that we did at KTXT. That's something I did as a club DJ too, where you have to introduce people to music. People rarely hear a song once and fall immediately in love with it. You have to, I think, sandwich those new songs that they're unfamiliar with, and particularly if they're challenging songs or from an artist like, say, like Bjork, or, you know, someone that isn't necessarily somebody that is just instantly, you know, poppy, catchy songs. It maybe takes some time for it to grow on you. You know, to design a format where you can slide those songs in between like the obvious hits and the big hits and keep people listening for an extended length of time instead of just tuning in for like 10 or 15 minutes. I do think you end up introducing new artists and unheard artists, and sometimes even unsigned artists, to people who otherwise wouldn't have heard them. And the only way to do that, and only way to reach a certain type of listener like that, is to give them that spoonful of sugar and to sandwich those things in between songs they're familiar with. So yeah, you could say, well, you guys didn't play enough of this or that or the other, but had we done that, would anybody have been listening? Or would the people, you know, would those people have been exposed to as many songs as they were because of the way we did it, where they knew, okay, I'm going to stay tuned in, and yeah, maybe I won't like a song or two in an hour, but I'm going to like 80% of the music I hear, so I'm just going to keep this radio station tuned all day long. And the next thing you know, they're falling in love with music that they didn't think they would like, because now they've heard it 4 or 5 times maybe, and they're like, oh man, this is pretty catchy, I do like these, you know. So I think we were serving both purposes. We were playing music people liked, that people wanted to hear, but we were still, and if you look at the top 35s from our era, there's just as many, you know, Trip Master Monkeys on the list as there are Smashing Pumpkins on the list. Like, it wasn't like the playlist was only those bands. We were, again, we had a mission, we had a plan, and part of that was giving unsigned or unknown artists a platform by sandwiching them between two really well-known artists. I think that was a perfectly good plan that, again, I think we executed pretty well. So it wasn't that we were kind of like, you know, shirking our duty to introduce people to new music. We just, you know, maybe we could have played a little more otherwise, but I don't think the listenership would have been there. I think overall more people heard more new music by the approach that we took. You know, that's the way I looked at it anyway.
I can say the same thing is true for me, having worked there, because there were several bands and songs that would pop up on my list and I would play, and the first, you know, several times I heard them, I was like, bleh, what is this? You know, and then I ended up loving this.
Yeah.
You know, the one that popped into my head immediately was, I remember the first time I played it. It was a band called Medicine, which is a noise rock band. And they're actually a really good one. And like, I love those guys now. The first song I ever played from them at KTXT, it was on vinyl. And I remember I queued it up, and I thought something was wrong with the record. It sounded like someone threw a barrel of wrenches into a large industrial machine. And I was, what is this? You know, and then like the second time I played it, I was like, okay, I kind of hear what's going on here. And but you know, after 2 weeks of playing it all the time, I fell in love with that song. And I think that probably happened for a lot of people that were listening to the station as well. You know, we were giving people new music, even though we were also kind of giving them what they wanted at the same time. Yeah. So you're right about that you have to do both. You have to give them what they want, and then you can go, and hey, if you like that, how about this? You know, and then you might get to expose some new bands that way.
I still, you know, wanted us to play the more eclectic stuff and the stuff nobody had ever heard of, and to try to introduce new music. But you're right. The way you do that is to make sure your listeners don't go anywhere. And if all you play is stuff they've never heard before, then they are going to go somewhere else. They're going to get tired of it. They're going to want to hear that Smashing Pumpkins song, or that Pearl Jam, or Beastie Boys, or whoever it was. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tightrope act to walk that line. But you know, I felt like we did it well, and not only gave, you know, the listeners the stuff they wanted to hear, but also introduced them to the kind of stuff that they weren't going to hear anywhere else. And you know, hopefully, you know, Trip Master Monkey got some new fans. You know, Hagfish, King Missile, all these weirder bands that we've talked to about, you know, that we did play. I can guarantee you there are people that became fans of those bands that would never have you know, even heard of them if it hadn't been for us at KTXT. So it was a little bit of a tight wire act, but I thought we walked it pretty well.
I think the real tight wire act, and you guys pulled this off very well, is that, you know, this, for this style of radio, it doesn't really have a format. Like there's nothing you can't play if you want to, right? So, and you sent over a music log from back in the day, and I'm looking through it, I'm going, wow, what a wildly eclectic batch of songs these are, Yeah. And that's the beauty of college radio, is that you can do that. And to be able to take that wide a berth of music and get it down, whittle it down to a format is impressive. And it's not easy to do. And I really think, that era of the station was really benefited by kind of the things you guys did and the vision you had to do it, because it's not an easy task. It's not as easy as, we're going to play classic country music. Well, that's a finite batch of songs. And you can, this was not a finite batch of songs. It pretty much encompassed everything, because we were trying to play world music. We were trying to play hip hop. We were trying to play rock and old stuff too, and 80s retro music. It was a huge, huge swath of music that we had to whittle down into some sort of recognizable format. And I think you guys did a fantastic job of that.
Yeah, I think it had just grown organically, and you had, a commercial station may have just maybe a couple hundred songs in rotation at any given time, maybe 400 or 500 if they're a real deep station. We had thousands. I mean, I think there was over 2,000 songs, and most of them kind of just thrown into the recurrent category. So once they fell out of the top category, it was just like a free for all. And figuring out that there was so much good music that just really wasn't getting played because we were just almost like rolling dice and picking a song out of the air and trying to kind of figure out a way to make that more listenable, and again, not to exclude music, but just knowing that people were going to enjoy the station more if they knew that within 10 or 15 minutes of tuning in, they were probably going to hear a song that they liked, or a brand new song from like their favorite band that maybe they hadn't heard that song yet, but they knew that we were going to play those bands. And I think there's a point at which a certain number of listeners just kind of trust you, right? They've listened to you long enough, and now they're on board. So they trust you, and you can start taking more chances. And this is true if you're like an individual DJ, or it's true if you're a radio station, that once you gain their trust, then, and I think maybe that we did evolve it through time, but it was really, that initial just, pouring through literally a list of thousands of songs and trying to figure out what belonged where. And it was a lot of work, but I don't know how we got real deep into that subject, but it was fun. And it was a big part of, I guess, me and Keith's time there for sure. But, beyond that, and I think to kind of circle around and put a bow on this, here we are 30 years later, the three of us are talking to each other because of KTXT, because we met in college radio. And one of the things when we were doing the film is realizing that almost everybody that we interviewed or talked to that maybe didn't make it into the film, or maybe we just traded emails or something, they all talk about the friendships they made, the fact that they're still friends with a lot of the friends they have now, especially like their old friends are friends from college radio, just like, we are still friends now. That takeaway might be above and beyond the music, above and beyond job training or what your career path may have taken. And you made a good point that college radio gives you confidence and communication abilities that can be used in almost any career. But beyond all of that, all the many great things that came from college radio is, I think at the top at everybody's list was like the friendship, the tribe, the finding your people, whatever phrase, you use. It was a universal thing. I think it was true for all of us. It was true for every single person I interviewed that was in college radio. It was like, man, I was kind of lost in college. I didn't want to do a frat. I didn't want to do a sorority. I had never, I wasn't into sports or whatever. And I just was kind of flailing around. And then I found college radio. Then I found KTXT. And all of a sudden I was like surrounded by instant friendships, people that loved, sitting down and talking about the nuances of an album for an hour, or would debate, this band versus this band or whatever. Like that experience was happening in every city and every state that had a college radio station. We didn't realize it at the time because there was no internet. We didn't really connect a lot with other stations, but we were a part of this thing that was happening all across the country, where college kids were finding the station, finding this thing they love to do, but also finding their people, which just to me is is the coolest thing about college radio, and the thing that I hope never ever gets lost. No matter how much the music industry changes, no matter how much radio changes, no matter whether the station is an over-the-air station or an internet streaming station, none of that matters as much as, is there a place where these college kids can go and be physically around, other people who love what they do and love the same things that they do, and have this passion to share music and get on the air and talk into a microphone, because that is the essence of it. On top of everything else that's great about college radio, that is the most important thing. And that's, why I made the film, and that's why I kind of still want to do the podcast, is just to keep reminding people how important that is, and to make sure that you're supporting and like trying to help out your college radio station that's in your area, because I think it's important for kids that are in college now to have that same opportunity that we did, because of how important it was to us. It was huge. And if you are interested in college radio still, and I'm assuming if you're listening to this podcast, you most certainly are, there is a film called 35,000 Watts, The Story of College Radio. We've kind of referenced it a few times. Some of the people that we talked about are in the film. Some of the musicians we've talked about are in the film. It is available right now on Amazon Prime or Google Play to rent or buy. We would super appreciate it if you went and watched that, if you told your friends to watch it, if you shared it with your family, shared it with your old college radio friends. And if you're going to watch it and you're there, you might as well also rate and review the movie. We would appreciate it. So 35,000 Watts, Story of College Radio, available now. Thanks. It was this is the end of season 2. It was great to talk about all the different music we talked about. It was really fun to kind of wrap it up with the talk just about our time in college radio. We will be back. We're going to take a little hiatus for the early summer, but we'll be back soon enough. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for supporting college radio in general. Thanks to my friends Scott Mobley and Keith Porterfield for joining me on the podcast. It has been one of the joys of doing the film and then continuing on is reconnecting with people that I had not connected with in a long time. There's a few people that I did with the film, and now getting to do this podcast every couple of weeks with my buddies has been the highlight of this past year for me. Just really like getting to, it's just like old times, like just getting to talk about it. So thanks to you guys for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate you guys doing this. And to all of you out there, thanks so much for listening, and we will return soon with 35,000 Watts, the podcast.